So I'm Rory Carroll. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of New Hampshire, and I'm going to talk today about human impacts on the diet of every New Hampshireite's favorite predator, the bobcat. So a lot of you may remember a few years ago, bobcats were sort of thrust into the news because the population is growing in New Hampshire, and there was a proposal on the table to open a harvest season on them. And it was a very interesting time to be a bobcat researcher, to say the least. Provided some really good learning opportunities. One of the things I learned is that New Hampshireites, no matter which side of that debate you were on, whether you wanted to open a season or not, you're very passionate about wildlife, which is an awesome thing. Another thing I learned is that the relationship between humans and any wildlife species really, but especially a predator like a bobcat, is really complex. Probably even more complex than even I realized at the time. And one of the reasons it's so complex is just because of the huge area that humans have come to take up on the landscape. And a few years ago, some researchers tried to quantify that using what they called the Wildland urban interface. The WUI, yeah. So they did this for all 50 states, and basically they quantified areas that had a certain housing density for humans that were within a small distance of large continuous wildlife habitat blocks. And you can see the results here for New Hampshire. Everything that's in the orange is what qualified as the WUI. So if we look at New Hampshire in relation to other states in New England and in the United States, New Hampshire actually ranks one of the highest states in the country in terms of the percent of land area and the percent of the human population that lives within that interface. New England as a region in general is much higher than the national average as well. So we have this situation where we have a growing bobcat population, we have a huge human footprint on the landscape, and we have this great potential for contact and conflict between humans and wildlife. One of the consequences of that is that wildlife in those areas tend to move a lot less. There was just this most recent issue of the journal Science. There was a big study that came out that found that when there's a large human footprint on the ground, mammals tend to move a lot less, 60 to 70% less in some cases, which is really significant. And we see evidence of that in our New Hampshire bobcats. So part of my work was to do a population genetic study looking at movement patterns across the region, and we found that there wasn't necessarily one large connected bobcat population. Rather, there were these smaller subpopulations. And the sort of prevailing theory here is that those subpopulations are divided by major highways. And that definitely holds up in some parts of the region. So you can see the Interstate 89 corridor, which runs basically from Concord up to Burlington, Vermont, lines up really well with some of those. Same thing for Interstate 90 in eastern Massachusetts. But it doesn't seem to be telling the whole story because that doesn't happen in other places. For instance, Interstate 90 in western Massachusetts, which would cut right through this population, or Interstate 91 in this population, or New Hampshire 101 in that population. So there's obviously something else going on here as well. And one of the alternative hypotheses that the authors of this study put forward was maybe it's food subsidies. Maybe that has something to do with it. And it's not that they can't move as much as they just don't have to meet their habitat needs. And we see evidence of this in our population as well. So if you look at the human population growth in New Hampshire and the surrounding areas from 1950 to 2015, it's almost tripled in the region. So we have a huge influx of humans on the landscape. In that same time period, we've seen a really significant increase in the size of individual bobcats by as much as 30%, which is a really big growth pattern. So there's evidence that maybe food has something to do with this. So again, we have this growing bobcat population, we have an increase in size of individual bobcats, and we have an increase in humans on the landscape, which led to one of my sort of overarching questions of my research, which is this bobcat boom that we're seeing, is it in spite of the humans on the landscape, or is it perhaps because of them? And we can use isotopes to answer this question. So there's whole courses taught on isotope ecology. I'm going to give you guys like the minute or two Cliff Notes version of what you need to just understand the study. So first of all, an isotope is a naturally occurring atom of the same element that has a slightly different weight. In this talk, I'm only going to talk about carbon. So carbon-12 is the vast majority of carbon in the ecosystem, and there's a small portion of carbon-13. What I'm really interested in is the ratio between those two in relation to a standard. So the units I'm going to be talking about is this delta C13 value. And just remember that that's a ratio of heavy to light isotopes, and it's on a standardized scale. The next two are probably the most important, and that's delta C13 varies naturally in the environment at the base of the food web, and by that I mean plants. So plants that undergo different types of photosynthesis will have different delta C13 values. Conveniently, the vast majority of plants that grow naturally in New England are what we call C3 photosynthesizers, and they have a very distinct, very low delta C13 value. Also conveniently, when humans subsidize food webs, they tend to do it with a majority of two plants, corn and sugarcane. And both of those plants are C4 photosynthesizers and have a much higher, very different isotope signature. Lastly, the delta C13 values are incorporated into the growing tissues of a consumer, and they work their way predictably up food webs. So basically, you are what you eat. If a bobcat eats a rabbit, it's going to have a similar isotope signature to that rabbit, and that rabbit's going to have a similar isotope signature to the plants that it ate. All right, so to look at the diet of bobcats, we collected over 300 bobcat samples from ranging across two time periods. The first one was 1950s and 1960s, when the human footprint on the land was relatively low. And we also have a contemporary sample from the last 8 or 9 years. We also collected hair samples from 28 different prey species, because if we know the delta C13 value of our bobcats, and we know the delta C13 values of a bunch of different potential prey, we can sort of use models to predict the importance of each of those prey in the bobcat's diet. So we found a lot of variation in these delta C13 values in our study, and I just want to talk about a couple of things that were really significant in explaining that variation. And the first one was location. Just to orient yourself here, on the y-axis we have the delta C13 values, and remember, lower values are the more natural signal, and the higher we get on the scale, you're sort of inching toward more human subsidies. And it turns out Vermont was significantly more on the human side of that than either Maine or New Hampshire was. And interestingly, looking at USDA data, this might be due to agriculture. So in terms of percentage of land area that is in agricultural development, Vermont is about 3 times higher than either Maine or New Hampshire. So it could be that these agricultural areas are a large source of the subsidies that end up working their way into food webs. Another thing that explained a lot of variation was the time period, which was not unexpected. So the bobcats in contemporary time, when there's a lot more humans on the landscape, are showing that anthropogenic signal. But this suggests a trend of synurbization, which is basically where bobcats are becoming more dependent and perhaps even preferentially selecting for these human resources because they're plentiful and they're easy to obtain on the landscape. Another way we can look at these data, so we basically just turn that graph on its side here. So now values to the right are the more human signal, and values to the left are the more natural signal. And again, we have our historic and our contemporary bobcat samples there. So we can look at these, like some different prey species that might be responsible for these values. And if we look at rabbits and hares, muskrats, deer, and small mammals, these are all traditionally known as staples of the bobcat diet. And some sort of combination of those could easily account for the historic values that we see, delta C13 values we see. But if you'll notice that this contemporary signal is farther to the human side than any of those, so there must be some prey species over here that bobcats are using now that's sort of inching them more toward the human side of things.
Not small children, right?
I haven't tested small children, but I did test turkeys and every amateur farmer's favorite livestock, chicken. So those are actually probably two of the, maybe, or potentially anyway, two of the larger sources of prey for bobcats in contemporary times. So just to sum up, bobcats we know are increasingly taking advantage of these anthropogenic resources. Agricultural subsidies might be one of the large sources of those. And also we see this pattern of synurbization where bobcats might be preferentially selecting for these human resources, which in the long run can have pretty significant impacts on both the human and the wildlife communities. Future work, we're going to add more isotopes. So we're looking at nitrogen, sulfur for sure. We're also experimenting with hydrogen and oxygen to see if those are informative isotopes as well. The reason being that the more isotopes we have, the higher resolution we're going to have, especially in looking at the importance of each of those prey species within the bobcat's diet. I also want to zoom down a little bit. There's no ecological reason why a bobcat in Vermont is going to be eating something different than a bobcat in New Hampshire. So we want to kind of zoom down and get more into the landscape, like level, land use, land cover type of things that might be explaining some of this variation that we're seeing. And lastly, I want to link these data to my genetic analyses to see if this dietary information that we're getting might actually help explain some of that population substructure that we're seeing as well. So I have tons of people to thank for this, especially for sampling purposes, New Hampshire Fish and Game and Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and especially funding from the UNH Ag Experiment Station and the NSF. And if anyone has any questions, I would happily try to answer them now. Yes?
With your historic samples for your isotopes, you use small bones.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any bias in the uptake between bones and hair?
Yes. Yeah. So we accounted for that as best we could. So basically, since isotopes are only incorporated into growing tissue, hair represents maybe a month of diet, right? Bones are sort of being broken down and built back up over time, so it's like more of a lifetime average. Mm-hmm. But we had 6 or 7 bobcats that we were able to get hair and bone samples from, and the signals were pretty much identical. So it suggests that whatever they're eating, on a monthly basis is pretty much what they're eating their entire lives. But yeah, there was no significant really difference there. It's a great question.
So you trap the bobcat to get the hair, or how do you get the bobcat hair?
No, all the bobcat hairs came, the ones that came from Vermont were from necropsy sessions with all the bobcats that were hunted and trapped. And New Hampshire was from, incidental traps, road kills, things like that, just collaboration with fishing game.
So that many animals are getting killed then?
Yeah, so it's over a period of 7 years, I think, so yeah.
Cool.
Yep.
That was really cool. I was just wondering about the wild turkey signal, and I think I missed your graph on how you were interpreting that.
Mm-hmm.
Were you considering wild turkeys as human impact? Because the wild turkey population, as you know, I'm sure, has grown a lot since the 50s, just the wild. So
right.
You could consider wild turkeys as a wild signal, no? Or
yeah, well, so if I actually. So it's actually a huge variation there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm thinking, they're probably getting some of that subsidy as well. So that's one that's sort of murky. It's not clearly human or clearly not. But I think when I can zoom down a little bit in the analyses and look at if there's like spatial variation in where those turkeys are coming from, I think that'll really help. Because like in certain areas, the turkeys are probably really benefiting from those subsidies more than other areas. So. Yeah, oh yeah, definitely. Well, that's the other thing. Back in the historic time here, 50s and 60s, there was like none. They were pretty much extirpated from the entire area. So it's a brand new food source anyway. So. Anyone else? Thank you.